Elisabet, good to, it's been years.
Where's your legal team, Ted?
No need. I dropped all 18 lawsuits the moment you landed. I assume your data confirms this.
All right, this promises to be interesting.
Perhaps we could have lunch brought in. You know, get reacquainted.
I know you, Ted. You screwed something up, something big, or you wouldn't have eaten the crow necessary to get me here. So spit it out.
There's a glitch in the chariot line.
Your killer robots?
Peacekeepers, yes, those.
So shut them down.
Obviously, Liz, we would, if we could. They're not responding.
Are you telling me a swarm has gone rogue, Ted?
It's worse than that.
Show me the data then. And I'll take that lunch. Alone.
Hey there, welcome to the Lord to Death podcast. My name's Brett, and today I want to dive into something that has been on my short list of episodes since the very beginning, but I never really got around to writing. At the time that I was just conceiving the podcast, I had just finished playing through Horizon Forbidden West, which shed some more light on the civilization that existed before the events of the game, and were responsible for the iconic robots that we see in the series. Long story short, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the modern civilization from the Horizon universe and explore what the tribes refer to as the Old Ones. And I'm not going to talk about all of the Old Ones, I'm going to talk in particular about two, and that would be Elisabet Sobeck and Ted Faro. I don't know about you guys, but I am a sucker for any game that gives me a bow and arrow as a primary weapon. Something about it is so satisfying, and if there's a bow in a game, you can bet I'm using it and pretty much nothing else, if possible. I find that usually games give you a bow as a substitute for a gun to use in stealth scenarios like in the recent Tomb Raider games, or the games are in a high fantasy setting and your weapons of choice are some form of sword and shield, magic, or a bow. But usually, especially in modern settings, the bow is limited to taking down unarmored targets from the shadows, and is largely ineffective against anything else. And Elder Scrolls is the exception because of how broken smithing and enchanting is. But Horizon is different because while there are other weapons available like the Ropecaster or the Shredder Gauntlet, the bow is your primary weapon, and its intended purpose isn't hunting down wildlife or people, but giant robotic creatures. Something about the dichotomy between a primitive tribal civilization and being able to spot a robotic mammoth in the wild really tickles my fancy. And it makes it even better that the way that you take down these robots is with just a bow and arrow. It's awesome. But I don't want to focus too much on the game itself, because what I wanted to talk about today is how civilization was before that time in the game in what would be our modern day and near future. We're going to talk about from the year like 2000 to like 2060. And like I said before, there are going to be two names that I'm going to repeat today, and those are Elisabet Sobeck and Ted Faro. And that is Elisabet and not Elizabeth, which is just so confusing to me. My brain really just wants to say Elizabeth, but I have to stop myself and think about it, so if I sound weird while I'm saying Elisabet, that's why. You can think about those two as our protagonist and antagonist respectively. There are also three main periods that I want to focus on, and we'll call these the different eras of the Old Ones. And those are the Great Die-Off, the Faro Plague, and Operation Enduring Victory, which is essentially the beginning of the end, the middle, and the end. There are also other periods during this time, but those are the three main events that I want to focus on today. And I also want to go over what the culture was like in general and what it was like to be alive at this time, but that'll come somewhere towards the end of the episode, because I think that everything we go over in the episode will contribute to a greater understanding of why it was the way it was. So without further ado, let's get into it by introducing our angel and our devil. Elisabet Sobeck was born in Carson City, Nevada on March 11th, 2020. Which is hilarious to think of now because she would barely be a toddler in our world. And this period was known as the Snoring 20s, a somewhat satirical take on the Roaring 20s of the 20th century, which was a series of rapidly worsening climate crises leading up to the Great Die-Off at the end of the century, which we'll go over in more detail in a minute. As early as 6 years old, Elisabet displayed an interest in electronics, burning down a pine tree in her backyard while playing with a children's electronics kit. The blaze would unfortunately consume a chicken coop, and after the fire department extinguished the blaze, she was forced to confront the fact that she had just taken lives, even if they were only chicks and chickens. Elisabet, being a child, did not really seem to care or understand the consequences of her actions and screamed out that she didn't care about the chicks, she was just having fun. but her mother would take her face in her hands and try to impress upon her the importance of using her talents for the good of the world, or they would mean nothing. It might seem like a little bit of a random tangent, but this event ended up leading to her altruistic philosophy that she carried with her throughout her life, and would shape her into the person that she would become over the next few years. Elisabet was a child prodigy, and moved on from burning down chicken coops to being enrolled at Stanford University by the age of 13, earning a Bachelor of Science degree in experimental physics and computer science by the age of 16. She then went on to earn a Doctor of Philosophy in Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Design at the Carnegie Mellon University at 20 years old. So she was hella smart, and clearly had an amazing drive to work. Just before her time, on December 24th, 2013, Theodore Faro, better known as Ted Faro, was born, and what a great Christmas present that was to the world. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, his early life was not as prodigious as Elisabet's, but he was a visionary nonetheless. He enrolled at the University of California for a degree in business at 18, but dropped out 2 years later in the year 2033 to found his own company, Faro Automated Solutions. The corporation was not an immediate success, but found its legs in the coming years towards the end of the 2030s, through its line of personal servitor and bodyguard automatons, which proved exceedingly popular. Faro Automated Solutions, or FAS for short, also developed the Focus that we see in the Horizon games, a small augmented reality device which was worn on the temple and served as a multi-purpose sensory interface. And those are a lot of words that mean a whole lot of nothing, so let me explain. The device was a small triangular metallic device with a single light strip going from center to tip, which was worn on the temple and attached sort of magnetically. It was tuned to the user's voice and gestures, making it extremely personalized to the user, sort of like Alexa, but actually useful. And you could carry it around with you wherever you go. It would display a 3D interface only visible to the user, which could aid in plenty of things from communications, construction, to operation of machinery, and you name it, it could probably do it. Similar to a smartphone, the Focus would be supplemented with a variety of apps purchased from an app store, from music to fashion to navigation. And again, much like the smartphone, it became a common household item for the 21st century, and remained functional into the 31st century, which is impressive in its own right. They just don't make things like they used to, which is funny because this is technically in our future. So basically, FAS was a company that focused a lot on augmented reality and robots. FAS experienced explosive growth towards the end of the century, and in the 2040s is when they really started to gain popularity during a severe climate crisis, which we mentioned before called the Great Die-Off. A multitude of disasters occurred due to climate change, and a number of civilizations were devastated. For instance, a Category 6 hurricane named Omega devastated Oahu, an island of Hawaii. As well, the Azores, a region in Portugal, sank into the sea along with New Zealand. The Pacific Ocean reached critical levels of human waste contaminants, bioterrorist groups started to form in an effort to quicken the effects of the climate crisis, likely in an attempt to end the world as they knew it, and as a result of all this, so many people were unhoused and there became an influx of what were known as climate refugees. These were people that were forced to relocate elsewhere because their home was either destroyed or underwater. In a British Thamesmead emergency relocation facility that housed these refugees, riots broke out due to poor handling of said refugees. This mistreatment that led to riots ended in the deaths of thousands, and shortly after, over 200 people jumped to their deaths from the Golden Gate Bridge in a suicide pact called Project GG Easy, which I never really understood until I said it out loud, how kind of messed up that is. While the cause of this pact was unknown, I can infer that it was sort of an end of the world, let's take matters into our own hands sort of situation, which is why I'm lumping it into the climate crisis, even though it technically doesn't fit and it wasn't a climate crisis on its own. But it was a crisis. It was terrible. In the year 2040, at the age of 20, Elisabet Sobeck joined Faro Automated Industries as her first job after completing her doctorate. Within 2 years, she was promoted to chief scientist. And over the next 8 years, she would go on to design and develop green robots, automatons that sole purpose was environmental recovery. This is what brought the FAS to the forefront of the efforts to undo severe climate change done during the past couple decades, in an era that would be known as the clawback. Ted Faro himself personally funded and provided resources to Project Firebreak, which was an effort to stabilize the Yellowstone caldera, a supervolcano beneath Yellowstone National Park, which threatened to wipe out much of the planet and its population. The operation was not only successful, but resulted in nearly unlimited clean geothermal energy to the continent. or it would have been for the continent if the US wasn't so greedy and kept it all for themselves. Through their combined efforts, Elisabet Sobeck and Ted Faro were able to use robotics to essentially save the world. Unfortunately, Elisabet wouldn't see the glory from this, and Ted Faro was seen as the man who saved the world. But Ted Faro was not satisfied with being hailed as the man who saved the world and decided to take his company in a different direction. Focusing more on his original line of bodyguard automatons and evolving them, in 2048, Faro diversified into the military market, which was quite a lucrative effort on his part and propelled FAS to be the most successful business in history, dominating the world market for automated military automatons by 2053. This made Ted Faro the world's first trillionaire, while it only really served to piss off Elisabet. Once Faro started going into the military market in 2048, Elisabet resigned from FAS and founded her own environmental technology company, Miriam Technologies. Miriam Technologies would go on to be the world's leader in green technology, and went on to win numerous accolades for its work, including the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2056 and the Rachel Carson Award for Environmental Progress. Things were going fantastically for Elisabet. Meanwhile, unfortunately, in his wealth, Ted Faro became greedy and paranoid, and he saw Miriam Technology as a direct competitor, and accused Elisabet of stealing their work through numerous lawsuits. He would continue to harass her over the next several years, believing that he was untouchable, and this overconfidence would ultimately lead to his downfall and the downfall of civilization as they knew it. The pinnacle of Faro's success was in his Chariot line of combat automatons, which were a line of military robots that would essentially replace human armies. The Chariot had 3 classes: Scarab, Khopesh, and Horus. In Horizon, these were what we would know as the Corruptor, Deathbringer, and Metal Devil, respectively. The Scarab, or the Corruptor, was a midweight combat unit which stood on 4 legs and had a tail of sorts that it could use for melee attacks. It also boasted incredibly nimble movement and was able to scale all different kinds of terrain, and had the ability to fire explosives. The Khopesh, or Deathbringer, was a heavyweight unit which stood on 6 stout legs, thus was much less mobile than the Scarab, but it had armaments to make up for it. It had a flamethrower, a grenade launcher, as well as heavy and repeating turrets. Then there were the Horus units, or the Metal Devils, which were large enough to scale mountains and had the ability to burrow. It resembled something like a sea monster or a giant lobster-scorpion hybrid robot. It stood on 10 legs with a segmented tail that trailed behind it, and it had 4 massive tentacle-like structures on its front, each were as long as its body, and they had massive drills on the end of them that would be used for shredding heavily armored targets or to dig out land masses to make fortifications and bunkers. It was also equipped with EMP charges and guided missiles that could act as an anti-air system, as well as a giant laser cannon and anti-personnel missiles. This thing was a nightmare. But the terror doesn't end there. The Chariot line was so popular because they essentially required no maintenance once they were built. Not only were they capable of learning through AI and adapting their strategies after every engagement, but they were also capable of self-replicating and self-repairing. The Horus was equipped with a hangar and production facility that could replicate these Scarabs and Khopeshes faster than the factories could, and each individual unit was capable of repairing itself. And since each individual unit was capable of repairing itself once they were deployed, they were basically unstoppable, which was Ted Faro's goal. They ran on fuel initially, but were equipped with the ability to consume biomass to make up their fuel reserves in an emergency, making it easier to deploy them in a long war, so that you didn't have to go and refuel your units. The icing on the cake was that Faro specifically requested that each unit was equipped with a nigh unbreakable encryption, ensuring that it could not be remotely hacked and controlled. But that also meant that they could not be remotely shut down if they ever went rogue. And this is the definition of hubris if I ever saw one. So you have 3 different kinds of AI-driven military units, which used swarm tactics to surround and overwhelm their opponents, and would learn how to be more efficient with every encounter. They could endlessly create more units and maintain themselves by consuming biomass, which meant that as long as there was life on Earth, their numbers were essentially infinite, and they could not be stopped, even by their creators. I'm sure you can see how this would go wrong. The chariots were given to countries, militaries, and private contractors alike. And in 2064, one swarm of chariots stopped responding to commands and began attacking their owners, the Hearts Timer Energy Combine. Faro demanded that the automatons be remotely accessed and shut down immediately, only to have finally touched the sun in being reminded that his insistence to make sure that they specifically could not do that meant that this was impossible, and that these chariots could not be contained. In a moment of clarity, and maybe one of the only good things that he ever did, he turned to the only source he knew that could potentially help, Elisabet Sobeck. Realizing the ramifications of his lack of foresight, he set a meeting with his former employee in an attempt to set things right. Elisabet was asked to analyze the situation and come up with a possible solution to the rogue chariots, and her findings had no silver lining. Because the chariots were designed to consume biomass in order to replenish their fuel reserves, they were consuming all life on Earth at an alarming rate in order to keep their numbers up. This included everything from plants to animals to humans. And Elisabet estimated that within 15 months, the swarm would overrun the entire planet and strip it of all life, leaving the Earth sterile. And thus, Ted Faro, savior of the world, had just sentenced humanity and Earth to death in just over a year. But on the bright side, the chariot swarm worked just as intended. It was unstoppable and loyal only to its owners, except that they now served themselves. This swarm of chariots that would end the world would come to be known as the Faro Plague. Knowing that containment was not an option, Elisabet came up with a plan that would have a different outcome than anyone could have anticipated. She knew that they could not win against the swarm, and so she intended to instead embrace their end and try to start a new beginning after their inevitable downfall by creating a fully automated global terraforming system that would eventually brute force and broadcast the swarm's deactivation codes and restore the planet's ability to sustain life through terraforming. This also included bringing humans and other life back into the mix after a period of time through cloning. This project would be dubbed Project Zero Dawn, and was not accepted openly at first. Faro insisted that there had to be another way to win, but was ultimately convinced that this was the only way, after being threatened by Elisabet to be revealed as the man who sold the world to the public, ruining his reputation, his company, his everything. So instead of having his misdeeds go public, Ted personally funded Project Zero Dawn out of his own pocket, which I'm sure all in all barely made a dent, and Elisabet started her work. Zero Dawn was a complicated process, but I'll do my best to break it down here. Project Zero Dawn was physically a global network of underground bunkers which consisted of automated manufacturing and cloning facilities that were dedicated to terraforming and restoring life to the planet. It had to be underground because it had to be somewhere that the Faro Plague would have a hard time getting to, and somewhere that they could mask their signal. Not that it would have been impossible for them to find the network and bring it down, but being underground would make it harder at the very least. At the heart of the system was a supercomputer that housed a powerful AI system called Gaia, who was to be the project's overseer when there were no more humans left to control it by themselves. Once they created Gaia, the humans' job was essentially done. Gaia would take the job of creating machines that would build the rest of the facilities, since the bulk of the physical work could not be done before the Faro Plague tore down civilization. Gaia was equipped with 9 subroutines that all performed specific functions in Project Zero Dawn. These were Ether, which was to detox and stabilize the Earth's atmosphere through weather control. Apollo was responsible for the archival of human history and culture, and would serve to educate the new generation of humans. Artemis would reintroduce primary faunal species from preserved genetic stocks. Demeter would reintroduce the secondary floral species. Eleuthia was responsible for the reintroduction of humans into the world via cloning, and raising humans from cryogenically preserved stocks of embryos at cradle facilities, which were underground bunkers that held artificial wombs for gestation and child-rearing facilities. This is where Apollo would come in to teach the new generation. Hephaestus was in charge of designing and maintaining the cauldrons which housed the machine production facilities, and in other words, it built robots. Minerva was the heart of the supercomputer that was going to brute force its way into the Faro Plague and broadcast the deactivation codes, as well as acting as a firewall and cloaking system for Gaia. And Poseidon, who was aptly responsible for the detoxification of the Earth's hydrosphere. And finally, there was Hades, which was an odd one because it was actually built to destroy, not create. Elisabet figured that Gaia would probably not create a perfectly habitable biosphere on its first go, and so she built Hades to act as a contingency. In the event that the biosphere was not fit for human life, Hades would be activated to essentially tear down the world again so that Gaia could start from scratch. It's important to note that while all of these functions are those of an AI, none of these functions were originally AI themselves. They were all built to be extensions of Gaia so that she could facilitate all the necessary functions to restore life to the planet. Eventually, Hades would gain a mind of its own, which we see in Horizon Zero Dawn, but that was more or less a fluke, not an intention of the design. Also, you might have noticed a trend amongst the naming conventions. Pretty well every function of Zero Dawn was named after a Greek god or goddess who represented their role in restoring the Earth. The exceptions being Minerva, which was a Roman goddess, and Ether, which was a Greek wind spirit, but that's close enough, I'd say. Gaia was also the most advanced AI ever created, and the only AI to have a sort of sentience of its own. Elisabet made sure to take time to teach Gaia empathy and altruism, and would often vent her frustration or her feelings about the end of the world to Gaia, which gave Gaia a sense of purpose and a sense of feeling and a sense of empathy, which meant that Gaia was actually able to feel things. I just thought that was pretty interesting. So, Gaia would facilitate the terraforming of Earth via machines and reintroduction of life through cloning. If anything were to go wrong with any of the functions or the terraforming itself, Hades would be activated and they would start from square one. The most important part of Zero Dawn was to deactivate the rogue chariots, which Elisabet estimated would probably take 50 years to crack. In that time, they would build their underground bunker, and once they got rid of the Faro plague, then the other subfunctions would start their job. I'm sure you can imagine that this plan had its own moral challenges. Like I said before, Elisabet gave the Earth 15 months before it was torn down by the Faro plague, and Minerva wouldn't be able to break the Faro plague's encryption for around 50 years. That meant that in order for there to be enough time to implement Zero Dawn, the entire global populace would have to sacrifice itself in a futile effort to stop the swarm, and they were only there to slow its advance, but would ultimately fail and die so that humanity could live again in another age. Because of its futility, the world could not know that they were doomed to fail. If they did, then there would be no reason for them to fight, and honestly, there would probably be another mass exodus of suicides and infighting. To execute this project, they needed the most brilliant minds on Earth, but they needed to be sworn to uphold the secrecy of the project so that the global population didn't lose hope and would continue raging against the machine. This also meant that there was no job posting for Zero Dawn. Scientists and other bright minds were abducted from their homes and taken to the site of Zero Dawn, where they would be given a breakdown of the project and a proposal to work on it. If they accepted, they would not be allowed contact with the outside world. If they refused, they were given the choice between being indefinitely detained with no contact to the outside world or to be medically euthanized, all in the name of keeping Zero Dawn under wraps. This was a hard pill to swallow, and initially Elisabet had her proposals shut down by the US Robot Command, but she persisted and was able to convince them that this was the only way. And so there was only one thing left to do once Zero Dawn was underway: slow down the robot swarm. At this point in time, the US and many other countries did not have a human military. Their military consisted entirely of automatons, which posed a problem in fighting the Faro plague. They couldn't just send robot against robot, because the Faro plague had learned how to forcibly take over hostile robots and drive them to fight on their side. So the US implemented what would be known as Operation Enduring Victory, a civilian enlistee global war campaign. The naming convention was deliberate in sounding like humanity had a chance, when the reality is that everyone involved would die very quickly. Regardless, they fought hard. Billions were armed and sent out against the Faro plague, and it worked better than expected. Instead of 15 months, Operation Enduring Victory granted them 2 years to work on Zero Dawn before it was ready in 2066. And in that same year, the human military was finished as well. There were bunkers built specifically for scientists and others working on Zero Dawn called Elysium, where after its completion, they were slated to live out their lives in relative comfort with enough resources to last a lifetime or two. Ted Faro would live his post-apocalypse in a bunker of his own called Thebes, while Elisabet and her group of scientists took up residence in Gaia Prime, the facility that housed Gaia. In his last physical meeting with Elisabet, Ted seemed like he was on the verge of a mental breakdown, which is fair considering how he single-handedly was responsible for the end of the world. He eventually became obsessed with the new generation of humans that would be created, likely out of guilt that he felt responsible for them. Ted would constantly pester Elisabet's team for updates on Gaia, even though he wouldn't understand what they were talking about because of the technical nature of all of it. After all, he was a businessman, not a scientist. He was an idea man, but he didn't have the know-how to understand how this all worked. Elisabet would personally take on his request so that Ted wasn't harassing her other staff, because he could get pretty uppity if he wasn't getting what he wanted. However, one day, Elisabet would give her own life for her fellow bunkmates. One of Gaia's ports malfunctioned, failing to close within the 2mm maximum seam necessary to prevent a detectable energy signature leak, which would compromise their location. If found, the Faro plague would attack and destroy the facility, and so Elisabet went outside to manually fix the seal and was permanently shut out. The others tried to find a way to get her back inside, but Elisabet knew that any way back in meant a potential security breach, and so she refused to allow them to find a way, sacrificing herself so that Gaia could continue. This was a true demonstration of her selflessness and altruism, just showing how dedicated she was to the cause. A lot of the time, the people who come up with these plans aren't willing to die for it, but she was, and I think that's what kind of set her apart from the rest of the crowd. This meant that unfortunately Ted Faro no longer had access to the information which he was requesting, which caused his obsession with a new generation of humans to deepen. I mentioned before how Apollo was to preserve human history and teach it to the new humans. Ted, in his almost feral state, became convinced that this knowledge was a danger to the new humans and decided that humans decided a fresh start without the knowledge that would make them doomed to repeat his mistakes. Somehow, and there's no explanation as to how, Ted managed to get security clearance that was higher than Elisabet's and unilaterally deleted the entire Apollo archive. After this, he called a meeting with the survivors of other bunkers via hologram. He explained his thought process, how the archive was a disease that should never be passed on to new humans, that they were blameless men and women who didn't deserve to suffer the same fate as they. He also explained how he deleted the archive and was met with sheer anger, and understandably so. They tried to figure out a way to restore the archive, to which Ted assured them that they would not be able to. He then declared that sometimes to protect innocents, innocents have to die, and used his security clearance to vent the room's atmosphere, killing the survivors of the other bunkers. I think that the real motivation behind Ted Faro deleting the archives was to delete evidence that he was behind the whole thing. If you were to look at the facts, he was undoubtedly the antagonist, and I think that his massive ego couldn't take the fact that people might be looking at him as such. It was also so that he could be given the chance to live and give humanity a fresh slate from his own teachings, essentially immortalizing himself as a god to the new humans. Ted lived in his bunker with a few others, one of which was a geneticist named Dr. Narong Somtow. Dr. Somtow was given the task of giving Ted extensive genetic therapy to stop his aging process, which was actually successful. They were able to stop his cellular aging, but at a great cost. There began physical mutations, all of which had to be treated individually and were difficult to stabilize. As time went on, Ted's mental state continued to degrade, and he became paranoid of the few who survived with him. He ended up flipping an off switch, a mechanism secretly implanted in all of these survivors that would cause instantaneous heart failure, killing those who remained with him with the exception of Dr. Somtow and Dr. Somtow's daughter, who would both later commit suicide, which left Ted with no one to treat his growing mutations. Ted, all alone, found himself in the generator room of his bunker in hopes that proximity to the energy would somehow halt his mutations. After about 1,000 years, he would get his wish in meeting the new humans. Dr. Somtow's work let him live for that time, but the mutations grew unchecked. His body was nothing but a giant mass of flesh and bone, covering the entirety of the generator room in something that looked straight out of Resident Evil or Silent Hill. His mind was hardly intact. He wasn't capable of speech past primal screeches and roars. And funnily enough, those who found him were a cult dedicated to Faro. Their leader, Sio, believed himself Faro reincarnated, and believed Ted to be some sort of old god. Upon finding Ted's body, a mutated mass of flesh, they ordered it to be burned with the rest of the facility, because that Ted Faro was not something you could bring home to your family. And that was ultimately the end of Ted Faro. He and everything that he did was lost with Thebes. The legacy of Elisabet Sobeck and Ted Faro would echo through the new world, but hardly anyone knew them by name, or knew what happened to the old world. Ted Faro's ignorance led to the destruction of the world, and Elisabet's sacrifice made sure that the world was born anew. Both of their creations, the Faro Plague and Gaia, roamed the earth far after they were gone, and a new generation of humans were given a second chance. So with that out of the way, I just wanted to take some time to go over the general culture of the old ones. We could tell by Ted Faro's example that the world was largely dominated by corporations, but it goes a little deeper than that. Money is power, and power is absolute. If you were wealthy enough, you could hold seats in government in some countries. And in those countries, a single corporation could dominate and engineer the entire political landscape. Because these corporations were so powerful, they could essentially do no wrong. If they did, it was covered up without repercussions. Something similar happened with Ted Faro and FAS, where the world never knew that he was the one responsible for the Faro Plague, and the term was only used internally to those who were fighting it. It was ultimately because of this culture of industry that Ted Faro and Elisabet Sobeck were able to get where they were in the world. The rampant industrialization is what led to the climate crisis, where they both had gained renown for helping curb climate change and initially restore Earth to be habitable again. But because their efforts to reverse climate change and do pretty much anything were dependent on automatons, the world had a nasty dependence on robots and automation. Many jobs ended up being entirely taken over by automation and robots, leading to a global unemployment crisis. During the 2050s, many Americans actually immigrated over to China in search of work in the form of manual labor so that they could do something. But many people just found themselves without a job. There were plenty of riots against this issue. In one instance, a casino workers union called Unity 47 had its members revolt against the automatons that replaced them at the casino, and they destroyed many of the robotic dealers in an anti-automaton protest. The job crisis, as mentioned before, also extended to the military, as by 2052, the United Kingdom's Air Force decommissioned all human pilots in favor of automated combat forces, and in 2055, the US military had removed all human combat forces in favor of a fully automated military. This led to veterans being neglected even more than we know them to be today. In 2062, 75% of the United Kingdom's veterans were unable to cover their living expenses under their pension, as their funding was gradually siphoned into the pockets of prominent corporations. Having automated military forces meant that wars were morally easier to wage, since technically no lives were being lost on the front lines if it was robots versus robots. Many wars were waged over the course of a couple decades, and the automatons were used to oppress and enforce class systems. After all, you can't put a robot on trial for killing a human who was protesting their rights. It's just a robot. And the people who owned these robots owned the government and the judicial system, so you couldn't penalize them. This led to a myriad of moral social issues. And as evident in the games, holograms were a prominent form of social media. Holograms took over as tour guides, secretaries, among other things, and as mentioned before, the focus became a household item. Imagine instead of having to pick up your phone if you could just tap your temple and think about what you wanted to see, how much easier it would be to be terminally online. I can't say this for sure, but I feel like social media was probably a much larger issue in this time because of things like the focus. If you can imagine all of the disgusting things that happen in the name of social media today, like these TikTok pranks and the dehumanization of people on social media for clicks, I can't imagine how much worse it was in their world. But that should give you a decent idea of what it was like to live in their world. Corporations dominated the planet, countries were literally falling into the ocean, most people didn't have jobs, and any attempt to protest for your own rights was met with a military automaton beating the hell out of you. But with that bleak prospect out of the way, I think that leads me to my favorite question. What do you think? Do you think that if someone else were in Ted Faro's shoes, who was of sound mind, that automatons could have been used for good instead of bringing about the end of the world? Maybe if Elisabet were put in charge of FAS and they never made the Chariot class, maybe things wouldn't have been as bad. Although I have a feeling that no matter what, some evil would have risen, as it usually does. Maybe it would have been the increasing number of bioterrorist organizations that brought about the end, instead of robots. But you can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media or podcast websites. If you have an idea for an episode, please feel free to send me a message or use the fancy Spotify Q&A option on the Spotify app to let me know what you want to hear about. Until then, remember that while your job may be expendable, you are not. Jeff Bezos may not care about you, but I do. So be kind to other people and never lose your humanity. And I'll chat your ear off next time. See ya.